Welcome to the Hamilton Science Faith Forum of the Hamilton chapter of the CSCA. For those who don't know me, my name is on the screen. I'm Janet. I'm the chapter coordinator. So we're just talking about upcoming events. The next upcoming event is the ASA and CSCA annual conference in San Diego area at the end of July. Dana just put the link up in the chat. It's also on the CSCA website. So hope to see some of you live in person there. But for today, we are happy to have David Chettle with us. Now, I've had the pleasure of knowing David for a good 11, 12 years or so. He was actually one of the founding members of the Hamilton Science Faith group, which had various names we were trying to remember before it was sort of officially a chapter. So David is a recently retired professor of applied physics, applied medical physics, I guess, at McMaster University. And unfortunately, one of his retirement plans is to move back to England. And he's looking for inexpensive real estate there if anyone has any tips for him. So we will definitely miss David because he's been a vital part. He's been on the planning committee for years and years and has been a vital part of the local Hamilton group. But we do get one last chance on his presentation today to hear him, and he's going to be talking to us on limits in science and faith. And I will remind everybody to mute your microphones and we'll have a discussion time at the end.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Janet. What I want to talk about is limits on knowing in particular, and I hope that will come out. I think much of what I've got to say, well, almost all I've got to say is not new. Quite a bit, I think, is not particularly controversial. But there may be one or two things that you will want to pick up on in discussion. Let's just see. So let's get going. One thing I'd like to start with is, in a modern understanding, science is or can be seen as the pathway to secure knowledge. Now, I'm using modern here in the sense of not contemporary, but in the way of understanding that was perhaps very much to the fore in the middle of the last century. So pre-postmodern, if you like. And I think for many practicing scientists, that's where science sits. Now, on the other hand, in Christian understanding, it's not the only way, but revelation provides trustworthy knowledge of God and of how to live. So that sounds extraordinarily powerful. Now, really the question I want to put out there is, should a scientist on the one hand or a Christian on the other see limits to these pathways of knowing or understanding? So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, at least what I think I'm going to talk about. So let's start with science. So what about science as the secure pathway? As I'm going to explore, not all scientists and not all areas of fields of science would come to this. Scientific materialism, I think, comes close to making this claim that if you want to know something, you'd better follow science. And often it goes with you follow the scientific method. That in itself, of course, is problematic. What is the method? Now, much of our society isn't there. We're in an era of postmodernism, and in a less academic arena, we're in the context of conspiracy theories and disinformation. And so that certainly undermines, in a way that I wouldn't view as helpful, this idea of science as the secure pathway to knowledge, though I think it should be challenged, by the way. But even with a modernistic, middle of the last century view, I think most practicing scientists would agree that there are limits to scientific knowledge, and that's what I want to explore in the next couple of minutes. First, it's almost trivial. No practicing scientist is going to almost think this is worth saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Scientific knowing is incomplete. Just a couple of examples. Omicron is mild and transitory, fleeting in the South African experience. In Ontario, it's resulted in record high cases and hospitalizations and equal record high deaths. Those two experiences don't agree. No scientist is worried about this because it's early. People are working on it. There will be more information and more data. I think as working scientists, we accept as a given, of course, knowledge is incomplete. Otherwise, there'd be no point in working. There'd be no room for research. Another example, the kind of crescendo or building to crescendo of excitement over the James Webb Telescope is that it is expected, hoped, to lead to new knowledge, to new understanding, new physics, new cosmology. So what this hope of those most closely involved is the work coming from James Webb will demonstrate that present knowledge is incomplete. So this is not fundamental, it's not disputed, it's trivial, it's normal science. But one thing I think makes it worth saying, it's perhaps not widely understood in the general public, because for people who are perhaps a little distant, a little uncomfortable with science, incompleteness becomes a reason to distrust science altogether. And that then feeds into the whole conspiracy theories and disinformation that can plague our society. Okay, second area of limit, and I've kind of sort of put this as it's not that simple. If you like, the simplest, the scientific materialism has quite a lot in common with logical positivism, which doesn't quite come out of, but is fed by the late 19th century triumph of science and perhaps particularly physics. We seem to know everything. We seem to be able to predict everything. It's, perhaps we've reached the end of science because we know everything. And people were saying that kind of thing. However, I think there are different ways of expressing it. This is one way I like. It's not that simple. Science does not directly give us a window onto reality itself. It's a model. It's a model that helps us get our minds around it, that has explanatory power, we hope, and in most cases, though perhaps not all, it has predictive power. This can be seen as, or is seen in one way as critical realism. I put Ian Barber's picture up there. I believe Roy Bhaskar was probably more of an originator, but I've read it in Ian Barber, so I'm kind of attributing critical realism to him. And I'm sure it can have different twists depending on how one wants to think. Another similar approach is instrumentalism, which is often associated with Arthur Eddington. I put Bert Brockhouse's picture up there because Bert used to come to our science and religion discussion groups. He's obviously a hugely eminent scientist. He was a faithful Christian, a member of St. Anne's Roman Catholic Church in Ancaster. And he would describe himself as an instrumentalist. So what this is really saying is it's agreeing we're not accessing reality itself. Instrumentalism, in one sense, doesn't go quite as far as critical realism, in that it says, you know what? It fits, it works. So I'm not saying that it is the way reality is. I'm not directly accessing reality, but I've got a way of looking at things that helps, it fits what we know, and it works. I can make predictions. So that would be, I think, where Bert wasn't always the easiest person to understand. He seemed to be able to take 20 steps to my one. But I think that's where he would have been coming from. Continuing on this idea of limits, it's not that simple. A highlight from my point of view on this pathway is Karl Popper. And again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything new. This is theories can be falsified, they can't be proved. And of course, his classic little sketch of this is a positivist statement would be all swans are white. And you don't know any different till you go to Australia and they've got black swans. So you falsified it. Now, of course, it's not even quite as simple as you falsified it. You found a counterexample. But you get the point. It's not as simple as science just proves things. Nothing like that simple. In my experience in the physical sciences, an awful lot of currently practicing physical scientists, and I don't know more widely, are probably pretty in tune with falsification. Some of the other steps, let's move on to another step. Models can change, or this is Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Many people put this book as arguably in intellectual history of the sciences, the most important book of the 20th century. One of the things I really love about Thomas Kuhn is everyone says, of course, Kuhn. Yes, I fully take on board what he says. But I don't think anyone knows what he meant, including Kuhn. Reading Kuhn, for example, the Roads in Structure, which is a collection of essays, I get the strong impression he doesn't know what comes next, if anything. I still think it's a fabulous book. So what does come next? Well, one line is pursued by Imre Lakatos, and this is the idea that, remember, Kuhn is about revolutions, why ideas change, how models can be thrown out and replaced. And what Lakatos perhaps most remembered for saying is, yeah, but theories are not that easily overturned. And he has this image of a sort of central core and peripheral theories. And the central core is very robustly defended. The peripheral theories are there kind of to be given up if necessary in order to defend the central theory. So this is a kind of rescue of revolutions in the direction of a more positivist line. But that's not the only direction. Here's a couple of other directions. Paul Feyerabend's famous book is called Against Method. Now, I don't think he means there is no method. I don't think he means that it's anarchy. I think he probably does mean that as soon as we try to set up a nice logical system of scientific method, it's wrong. It doesn't actually work like that. Not in real life, not with real scientists. It's not that simple. You can't have a theory of theories. It just is not that easy to pin down. Or, of course, we can go further along, or if it is further, or another line is the strong program. There are many others, because I was reading about this in the UK. The person I heard it or read about it from is Harry Collins, who's a professor in social sciences at the University of Bath, I think. And this is basically saying, actually, science is a game played to agreed rules, and it's really no different to any other game. It doesn't have any inherent truth status. In one sense, though, he probably wouldn't like this analogy. If you play Monopoly, you stick by the games. I expect it's true, though I've never done it. It's also true of Dungeons and Dragons and those sorts of things. And of course, again, I'm afraid I didn't look it up. This approach of the strong program has also been a platform for undermining science's sense of self-importance with manufactured hoaxes, showing that it is just a game, and if you know the rules, you can manipulate it, and it's not necessarily anything to do with truth. And this, again, is getting much more into the postmodern conspiracy theories line. So what I've tried in this second limit to show is the nice, simple, cut and dried idea of logical positivism. It's difficult to stay with it. It seems to be more complicated than that. And there's a kind of truth in advertising or something, or disclosure. I think I may incline to some mix of Lakatos or Feyerabend, depending on the mood I'm in. And another thing to throw in there, the logical positivism has been associated with the idea that the real thing about science is objectivity, a kind of privileged view from nowhere. Well, of course, that just does not work. In perhaps some of the most fundamental things, think about the observer effects. The phrase that is sometimes used instead, although it can seem laughably complex, is intersubjective replicability. If I've designed an experiment and it works at McMaster, I'm going to be very reassured if it also works for somebody else's lab, not directly influenced by what we're doing here. So it's not being objective, it's just saying that this perspective, this experiment maybe even, also works for someone else. And therefore, in that sense, provisionally might be generalizable. Okay, third limit. And I've subtitled this, actually, even science is never truly unbiased. And I would say the reason for this, it's a bit like the whole Gödel thing in mathematics. You've got to have axioms, or put it another way, if you don't have presuppositions, you can't see anything. You have to have a framework for viewing before you can start to see. And the axioms aren't necessarily very constraining, I think. And sometimes, again, mostly that's the whole point about axioms, is you don't see them because you take it for granted. So every working scientist I've ever come across, okay, maybe I've avoided some, would agree that we assume the world is. The cosmos exists. I mean, we could debate it, but there's no point. We also assume that the world can be known. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to know it. I know it might seem sometimes that what I'm doing is an exercise in futility, but it isn't, excuse me, it isn't consciously so. Another thing which is commonly, I think, assumed is that there is such a thing as direction. In time, the cosmos has a beginning. We're not at the beginning now. Can still discuss what's going to happen and when and where, and in complexity. And this can either be defined or at least discerned. Now, not everyone would agree with this. As an example, some evolutionists, I think Dennett is an example of this, would not accept the idea of a tree of evolution because it implies a direction. An evolutionist in that position would say there is no direction. It's just a random walk. Now, much of the biological literature, even if it pays lip service to there's no direction, actually keeps thinking there is a direction. And as I say, complexity would be a line associated, in fact, with time. Anyway, that last can be debated, but axioms, something like that, are necessary, and often they're not in our forefront of our mind because it's just, of course, we take it for granted. Okay, science. What about faith? Well, it's totally different, isn't it? Well, yeah, no, maybe. The first one, I've possibly been a little unfair here, but natural theology. Natural theology draws inferences about the divine from scientific and other observations. And this is, I've been probably unfair to it. I would say it's at least partly discredited or perhaps unfashionable, but only if someone tries to treat it as a proof of God. I would argue it's still natural theology, still provides valuable understanding and can be very valuable within the worldview of faith. And I think there's a huge place for CSCA and ASA in this role for natural theology. It's a kind of psalmate thing. And I noticed, I think I may have been a bit unfair, but I noticed at Alan's suggestion, actually, recently reading a book by Alistair McGrath, he gives a lot more space to natural theology than maybe I would. And he also points out that Thomas Torrance does too. And this is actually interesting, that's Torrance, because Torrance, after all, is in one sense, person who brought Karl Barth into British theology. And when you think of Barth's almost dismissal of natural theology in favor of revelation, it's kind of that Torrance says, well, not quite so much. Anyway, that's an aside. Okay, a second area, and here we're perhaps on much firmer ground, but I still think an area of limitation, revelation. Again, not all Christians would put it this way, but I would want to affirm that revelation is direct from God. As such, that's absolute. And that's absolute truth. And that's completely secure, isn't it? Well, it is until a human gets involved. Because we all know what we're like, even the great ones, an Abraham or a Moses or whoever. Because revelation is from God, but it's through humans. And at the very least, every human is limited. And in practice, and we might discuss Enoch, every human is also in measure sinful. And so the revelation is no longer, if you like, as it left God. Revelatory accounts are collected, weighed, and tested, great stuff, but by humans. And, for example, the collecting together of the canon of Scripture. Now, okay, it's not a free-for-all. I believe, and I think it's completely true, that those humans were guided by the Spirit of God. But even humans wanting to be faithful to God, guided by the Spirit, indwelt by the Spirit, still muck things up at times. So it's not perfect. So now, and by the way, this isn't the only point of collection and weighing and testing and so on. Clearly it's not just the Christian canon of Scripture. But then Scripture is interpreted by humans. I've talked about this before. One of the disadvantages and I think impacts of Enlightenment thinking on Protestant Christianity is the tendency to have multiple interpretations of Scripture. There are other very good aspects of how Protestantism has developed, but it's undeniable that there are different groups of Christians who interpret Scripture differently. Sometimes really quite a lot different. So this constitutes a limit. We cannot say that our knowledge of God is absolutely secure, because it's a little bit like the whole objectivity thing. You can't take the human out of it completely. Okay, third thing, and I've done this really to go back to what I think is a fairly close parallel, as I'll show you in a moment, with the axioms that science has to have. Using just a different word, Christian faith makes assumptions. We assume God is. You could say, thinking of God as Father. We assume God is for us. And again, obviously here I'm thinking particularly of Jesus. We assume God is active. And again, in an orthodox, small o approach, the work of the Holy Spirit. God accomplishes works, often even through us. So there are, this in one sense is an intellectual limit. We have to make assumptions in order to move forward. This is just an almost silly thing. You'll see in the footnote, many, many years ago, the University of Birmingham had a program it called Interfaculty Studies. This is back in the 1970s. And in this, every first-year undergraduate student had to take a course outside their own specialist area. One of those courses was called Science, God, and Individual Belief. This was a series that ran for about 10 weeks, 10 lectures, and a seminar on another day in the week of the lecture. And you'd have maybe 10 to 20 students in each seminar, and maybe 10 sections in the course, and maybe 15 or 20 courses. So it covered a lot of students. I got involved as a seminar leader and later giving a few lectures on this Science, God, and Individual Belief. And the lecturers and seminar leaders would gather for coffee after the lecture, just chat. John Fremlin was the kind of lead atheist. He was also my PhD supervisor, so I knew him very well. For many, many years, he was my favorite atheist. Dan Hardy, philosophical theologian, was the kind of lead God person. And we came to the conclusion, we were discussing this, we'd like to be Occam razor type people, have the fewest possible assumptions. We agreed we needed assumptions. And we kind of came down to, we all agreed, atheists or Christians, that our number of assumptions was 2 plus or minus 1. The Christian perspective was that we had one assumption: God is one in 3 persons. So just kind of outline. Whereas from a Christian perspective, atheism is more costly. It has 2 assumptions. The cosmos exists and the cosmos can be known. I'd actually now kind of like to say 3, but that breaks down the 2 plus or minus 1 unless we're going into a wider probability band. The atheist perspective, well, atheism assumes 2 assumptions: the cosmos exists and the cosmos can be known. But Christianity assumes 3 assumptions: God exists, God is favorable to humans, and God acts in the cosmos. It was really just a bit of fun, but it does make the point that in one sense, we all have to make assumptions. It's not a whole blank slate. It's not, this is the view from nowhere. Or, of course, the atheist wouldn't use this. This isn't the divine perspective. We have to start from somewhere. So, drawing it together, so what? I have very nearly finished, so that's okay. In the end, as I've kind of just been saying, at least implicitly, and I think many people, it is implicit, not explicit, we make assumptions. Or another way of putting it, which has much more currency these days than it did in the 1970s, at least in my experience, we inhabit a worldview. Or if you want to put it more simply, we make a choice. We make a choice on what to believe. I also want to say that different worldviews can be compatible. Within, again, small o, orthodox Christianity, a critical realist or instrumentalist understanding and pursuit of science are quite compatible. I think actually that's what I've been doing for the last 50 years or so. Another perspective, within a critical realist approach to science, there is no necessary contradiction with faith. Within a Dawkins-like scientific materialism, there is a necessary contradiction with faith. But I think the critical realist approach, and I think in practice many scientists are somewhere near there, there's no necessary contradiction. I want to put it here, and this is a little bit provocative for non-faith thinkers in science. I would say faith, or if you want to make it more palatable to a scientific materialist, assumptions, faith is essential. I think within scientific materialism, this may be overlooked, denied, or at least it would be relabeled, because faith is a bad word there. And just to finish, and this going back more to myself and others in Christian community, that and this perhaps isn't very welcome, but even for Christians, there is no absolutely secure pathway for the reasons I've tried to outline. Another way of putting it is faith involves risk. It's a justifiable risk. It's a risk with huge rewards, but it's a risk. It's not absolute safety. I would actually also say the only absolute safety is death, and you know what? We don't want to go there. Faith involves risk. Or, again, as a Christian, there is simply no getting around trusting, having faith in God. At least until faith will vanish into sight. That's in that very well-known hymn by Christopher Wordsworth. Until I looked it up, I hadn't realized he was a nephew of the William Wordsworth. You know, the hymn, Gracious Spirit, Holy Ghost, and the kind of keeps coming back to therefore give us love. But one line is faith will vanish into sight, thinking along the lines of 1 Corinthians 13. Yeah, then, until then, faith involves risk, and we can't get around that. I think that's it. Thank you very much. If there are questions or objections or whatever, I will try and respond.
Thanks very much, David. I don't know if you want to, oh, you stopped screen sharing. Yeah, that was a very interesting and informative talk. I must say I particularly liked your picture of Karl Popper, but I won't put that on Facebook.
Right.
So we have a good 20 minutes for questions, and maybe people could just give, remember to unmute, and it would be nice if you could show your video as well. But maybe people could also just give a very brief, briefly introduce themselves as they're asking a question, so we can get to know each other. And you can use your either your real hand or your Zoom hand.
Arnold.
Hi, folks in Hamilton, and hello especially to you, David. It was good to see you at the other event that you were there with your son.
I really appreciated your support being there. It was great to see you there.
So for the rest of you who don't know me, although I think I have met many of you, I'm a physics professor at Trinity Western University over here in Vancouver, and I am also the executive director of the CSCA. So I'm feeling sorry that we're going to be losing you to the UK, but I'm sure you'll be active in the CIS when you're there as well.
Well, there is also the Faraday Society, and I might have to explore both.
Right. So I have two questions. I'll ask one first, and this one is in your career, and in many of us, for many of us who worked in the sciences with people of various faiths, and in fact of atheist background as well, or I would even regard atheism perhaps to be one of the various faiths. Yes. Most scientists that we interact with don't see science as the only way of knowing, and they don't see science as being totally objective. And we have a pretty nuanced view generally. I mean, our colleagues have a pretty generally nuanced view of what science is and its limits and so forth. But why is it that the general public thinks that science is totally objective and ought to be fully reliable, and you know, and that scientists think that they know everything? Like, why is it the general public thinks that way? In fact, I would include Christians among that, because many Christians have a big problem with science. They think, because they think that science is very absolute. Science denies God. Science claims to know everything. Science is arrogant, etc. Do you have any insight into why the general public and why Christians think of science in ways that don't comport with our own experience within the scientific community?
Thank you, Arnold. That's a big question. I think the simple answer is I don't have a real answer. I do think that communication plays a big role. I think as a scientist, I'm not very good at communicating. I get very excited about the science I'm doing and the research I'm doing, and I maybe overstate it. But also, what I nearly always want to do is to say, on the one hand, there's this, but on the other hand, here's another view. And I remember one time, I think a reputable Canadian radio program interviewed me at some length about an issue to do with public health and safety, which did intersect with some of my research. And I told them as best I could what I thought was a balanced view. And they were all very polite, and they said, thank you very much, and they never published that. I heard later from a colleague at another university that the same program had approached her, I think it was, and she had said, oh, go talk to David. And obviously they didn't, because there's a sense that at least that, although it's supposed to be reputable, program wanted at most a 1-minute soundbite that could be put in headlines. And that doesn't help us, regardless of what we're trying to say. I do think also that for some people encountering science in junior school, elementary school, and certainly in high school, they find it difficult. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, most of which I think might be tractable, but don't happen. And being difficult is off-putting. And it's the total opposite of an encouragement to engage. So that person is left with, do I just say, I accept what that science person is saying, regardless? Or do I just say, I don't trust science? And I think it's unfortunate that within certain areas of Christian churches, in support of some interpretations of Scripture, there's an underlying thread of don't trust science. And if you're taught don't trust science about some things, it's very easy to say, well, those scientists, they're just trying to deceive us. They're trying to manipulate us. I'm not sure that helps, Arnold. I don't really have answers.
No, that was very helpful. I think the big part there about not wanting to hear nuanced views and just a really simple, quick answer is one of the big problems in terms of science communication to the general public and including to the Christian community. I do have another question, but I'll wait for others to ask a question before I ask my second question.
Reino.
Hello.
Hello. Could you turn on your video, or is there bandwidth?
Sorry, my good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the other side of the world, so that's why my camera is off. I'm in Taiwan at the moment. It's early in the morning here, and I'm in my bed. Apologies. But,
that's lovely.
Yeah,
fine.
Yeah, I'm in Taiwan, but I'm Ray. I was raised in the Philippines, in the Republic of the Philippines, but I've been a teacher for 13 years in the United States, in England, and now at the American school in Taiwan. I am in Taiwan right now, but I am at the same time taking my second doctorate at the University of Auckland in education, because this is very interesting topic actually in science education, because I'm a practicing Catholic at the same time, but at the same time I found that science is well, actually, my focus of my research is looking at the spiritual dimension of of science, because from my personal perspective, based from my experience since I was young, for me, science is a gift. Like we can actually utilize science to understand what is out there. Again, I'm a practicing Catholic, that's why I'm able to connect it. That it seems to me that the more I understand the world or science or physics or chemistry, the more I understand the essence of God for me. It's like everything is like design, everything has a design or something. But anyway, the point is, yeah, I'm looking into the spiritual dimension of teaching science. I'm actually teaching advanced classes in physics right now, for high school kids, the AP Physics C engineering equivalent. So maybe anybody from this group can probably comment or refer some resources, or from your point of view, from the academia, to improve my research probably, and how to come up with a better understanding of the spiritual dimension. Because to be honest, this is quite new to me, the spiritual dimension thing. In teaching that science, especially spirituality, is quite sensitive in public school settings. So you know what I mean. But again, thank you so much. Yeah.
Reynold, first, thank you for doing us all the honor of joining us at a totally antisocial hour for you. It's
Yeah.
lovely to have you with us. Thank you. I do think that one of the strong themes one sees in CSA, CSCA, and particularly I think in ASA, and Dana herself might like to comment on this, is seeing the spiritual dimension in the sciences. And I know there's quite a number of people in the American Scientific Affiliation who can address that topic much better than I can. And actually what I'd like to do, ducking the question slightly, because I think there are people here who can address this better than I can. And please, if you have something you'd like to say to Reynold, please feel free to contribute.
My only comment, Dana, I believe there's like an ASA section on education.
There's a committee on education. It hasn't been active in the last year or so, but we do marketing, which is more outreach.
Anyway, Ray, if you look at the ASA website under resources, you might be able to find.
Yes, I'm able to access the website. Yeah, but thank you for some enlightenment and input. Yeah, it's just that from my end, science itself is knowledge itself, systematic body of knowledge, but does not really provide enough morality, and that's why the world is doing like this. For example, just early yesterday, we were talking about entropy, the concept of entropy, and that being said, yeah, the concept of entropy. So expect more chaos in the society, and so that being said, we should act on it, or whatever we can do. I mean, it's really amazing for me to understand science and able to connect to the reality and able to connect to my theology. It's like, wow, it's like amazing that everything has a connection. Even I am also a lecturer at the graduate school visiting in the Philippines, and some of my students are able to discuss some biblical text in a physics way. So, some of the stuff. But anyway, again, thank you so much and have a nice day.
Reynold, just one point that does occur to me. Some of those people who do talk about natural theology a great deal, I think are also overlapping with what you're talking about in terms of what we study in the sciences, actually enriching our understanding and enriching even our faith engagement with God. And I think many people would kind of cluster that sort of area under natural theology. Again, others might disagree, but that might be worth a bit of a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you.
Could I ask a question here?
Please do.
Thank you. David, I know you through the now deceased John Robertson.
Mm.
And I'm over here in London, Ontario, teaching at Huron University College, which is part of Western. It's Anglican in orientation. And something that's fired my interest over the past 30 years or so has been the issue of how God can act. We seem to be agreed that God does, but this is turning from an epistemological presentation which you gave to a metaphysical one, and that is, how can an incorporeal entity, or in our case, person, engage with something that's physical? Sometimes that's been referred to as the causal joint. Just wanted to know if you can add to that discussion.
My first response is, again, thanks, Herb. It's a great question. I also think it's a very difficult question. And I don't think I've seen lots of suggestions, and I think there are many good suggestions, and I don't think I've seen something that is the answer. Some people have postulated that there is a route through quantum uncertainty. That doesn't quite feel sufficient to me, though you could, although this actually flies in the face of the current approach to chaos, which is chaos as it's mostly pursued and delineated is deterministic chaos. However, I know there are people, purely from the physics point of view, actively researching quantum chaos. And not to find a causal joint. But the other line I would want to take is, I do love Anglican theology, actually, because you can think almost anything you want. As I'm sure you're more familiar with than I am. But I think too often we confine our thinking of how God is and how God is in the world to interactions with humans. Now, I think I'm a human. I think that's very important. But I would actually, although I don't go with process theology for quite strong reasons, I don't like the almost neglect of transcendence in process theology. I think it gets immanence very well, but I like from Whitehead the idea that all that is has in measure the capability of participating in an event and the privilege of event over being. And that means if, because let me backstep, I think it's quite easy to say the Spirit of God in a human is in measure a little bit like Jesus, a coming together of the divine and the human, which together, although in two natures, can still act. Now, obviously, we're not Jesus, but there is, in the gift of the Spirit, a coming together of the human and the divine. Not as in Jesus, but think of what Luke says at the beginning of Acts. In my former treatise, O Theophilus, I told you all about what Jesus began to do and to say. Well, he doesn't, I've got it wrong, but the implication being, what I'm now going to tell you is what Jesus, the divine human combination, carried on saying and doing through other humans. So I don't think, thank you, Reynold. I don't think one can exclude the idea of this divine human partnership is not a possible way for a causal joint. It still doesn't actually answer the question. You're then into psychology and things like that. And then I would want to go further, as I say, thinking of Whitehead. If the divine human link can work, why not the divine and other aspects of creation? It's not an answer. I'm not pretending it is.
Can I just follow up with that?
Sure.
I see Whitehead a little bit differently. I see it as being mostly transcendent and a little bit immanent. It's just the immanent is very effectual. And I'm wondering, just keeping Whitehead in view for the moment, does a more orthodox understanding of Christianity see a potential causal joint as operating at any more than a, whatever you want to call it, psychological, subjective, interior, as Teilhard would put it, an interiority-oriented approach? Do you see, is there an actual non-physical acting on a physical?
I think when expressed like that, non-physical acting on the physical, I can't produce anything like a mechanism. I think what I'd want to do is to say, and again, partly from Whitehead, the boundaries of what we call physical and what we call non-physical may not be correctly drawn in what we might term their conventional places. I think there may be less precision there. And incidentally, I agree with you about Whitehead. It's not Whitehead doesn't fully acknowledge transcendence, but a lot of people who have pursued process theology, citing Whitehead as their sort of source, have moved to the position of such an emphasis on immanence that it's difficult to find transcendence. And I think that is mistaken.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. I agree.
But I don't think that's why I go back to Whitehead, because process theology is so much around, I feel it necessary to give the qualifier that don't forget transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you, Herb.
Thank you.
So could I go ahead and ask my second question?
Thanks, Arnold.
You spoke about, before I ask the question, I wonder if anybody in the Hamilton area has heard of or remembers Raymond Koenig, who was a physics professor at Wilfrid Laurier. And I mentioned that because he was he passed away in 2007, and I gather he may have been a member of CSCA. And there was recently an asteroid named in honor of him.
Oh, wow.
And so, David, if you remember him, I might correspond with you a little bit and see what we can do.
I'm afraid I don't remember him, Arnold. I'm not even sure if I ever met him. He seems, from the little I saw, to have been at the height of his work probably through to the late 80s. And I know I've only been here since the beginning of the 90s.
Okay. So anyway, then here's my question. You did talk about both critical realism and instrumentalism. And I think it seemed to me that you were saying they are almost varieties of the same thing, or they're very similar to each other. And whereas in my thinking, I think of them very differently. The way that I think of instrumentalism is that instrumentalism doesn't make any claims about the reality of the world. It simply says, here are tools that we can use to cope with our experience and to make sense of things, so that we can do calculations and we can build things, but not have any make any claim about whether the things that we're talking about actually exist. Whereas critical realism says that the things that we're talking about do exist, but we're just not sure exactly how they look, and we're modeling them as well as we can, and we're improving in that. And so I wonder if I understood you correctly to suggest that instrumentalism was kind of like a variety of critical realism, or would you also identify them as being quite different from each other? Or is my characterization of instrumentalism actually incorrect?
No, I agree with your characterization. And if I suggested that one is a subset of the other, that's wrong. Because as you pointed out, if you like, from a theoretical perspective, they're actually very, very different. However, insofar as I ever could understand anything that Brockhaus said, his approach to an experiment and mine were pretty much the same. And the framework for understanding was pretty much the same. Whether we, to ourselves, thought of this as trying to, albeit indirectly, access a fundamental underlying reality, or whether we were trying to come up with a theory or a model, perhaps not model, a theory or a mathematical expression that fit the observations and that permitted predictions to be made without making any assumption about whether this was real or not. When you're doing the experiment, it doesn't really matter. I haven't got the brain power to do any theories, so I can only really do experiments, not even that anymore. So I tend to focus more on the experimental side. And I think the experimental practice that Bert obviously did extraordinarily well, and I toddled along doing for quite a while, are almost indistinguishable, albeit with a different theoretical framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's a more of a, from my perspective as a Christian, it makes more sense to be a critical realist than to be an instrumentalist, because in this way, then the world really does exist, and we are trying to understand the things that God has made, not just to understand how we are experiencing things in our consciousness. But also, it seems to me that even if you're not a Christian, critical realism would be a better motivator to study the world than just to find some equations that happen to work. But you're actually like interested in finding out, well, is there really this other planet that's disturbing the other orbits of the planets, or is there just some mathematical way that we can sort of contort things around? So that's why I'm a big fan of critical realism, and really for me, a really great book that gets into what critical realism is the one by John Polkinghorne, Belief in God in an Age of Science, which really is a sustained defense of critical realism from a Christian perspective. Yeah. So thank you.
Just on that, Polkinghorne is very much a favorite author of mine. I don't know if you're aware, but back in the late 70s, maybe, the BBC put on a series of programs, I think there are only half a dozen, called God and the Scientist. And one of those was John Polkinghorne. And it was, I think we were around at somebody else's and they'd left the television on, and I just was riveted. And I ignored everyone else because he was so good. He was also, and this was shortly after he had taken ordination, he was giving a colloquium in the physics department at University of Birmingham, where I was at the time. And he was talking about his reasons for taking ordination. And one person I overheard who was commenting on why he had gone, despite the fact that this person was an atheist, he said that he had John Polkinghorne as a lecturer in quantum mechanics when he was an undergraduate at Edinburgh, and he had never, ever heard a better explanation of quantum mechanics than John Polkinghorne, which I thought was a lovely testimonial from someone who was rather antagonistic to his beliefs. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit off topic, but.
Yeah, and John Polkinghorne has two really great books about the quantum world without even reference to Christianity. One of them is this very short introduction in the Oxford series, and the other one is called The Quantum World. So he was very well established in the field proper prior to his ordination, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could just add, I think the note that Janet wrote is accurate. Instrumentalism is similar to nominalism in the sense that as far as the scientific world is concerned, they wouldn't consider it to be realistic as such, but in name only. These are tools that we're using. I think that's a good way of characterizing it.
Thanks, Herb.
Mm-hmm.
And David, I just wanted to follow up. You were saying about thinking that God doesn't only work through humans, but can work with nature as well. You were saying something like that?
Yes.
So would you be comfortable with the incarnational model of divine action?
I'm not totally sure what you're referring to by the incarnational model. So could you explain
it's
a little?
It's quite a different way of seeing things, and it's more associated with the Eastern Orthodox theology. The recent book on it is Christopher Knight has written about that, but it's the idea that God through his Spirit indwells creation, so that we don't really have to think about this, outside in kind of thing. He's indwelling and working within it. I mean, it doesn't answer every question, but I find it a helpful view.
No, thank you, Janet. I do find, although I'm somewhere or sometimes Anglican and sometimes Baptist, I do find I enjoy hearing and reading from the Orthodox perspective, particularly when it comes to things about the Spirit, to pneumatology. Because I think my own theology is lacking when it comes to pneumatology, and I think that they're very helpful insights.
Well, if there aren't any other questions or comments, I would just like to thank you again, and again, not only for today's excellent talk, but also for your many years of assistance in the Hamilton Group and the CSCA.
Thank you, Janet.
Everyone.
And thank you, Dana.